I'm Jen Hayden, trending news manager at Daily Kos. I'm with Dave Neiwert of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And we wanted to bring Dave in to talk a little bit about hate groups, in particular in relation to Donald Trump. Dave, recently, Donald Trump has pardoned four people, I guess. All three of them have kind of connections to extremism. Can you tell us a little bit about those pardons and why they're important?
Sure. Well, I mean, the first one was Joe Arpaio, who has a long history of dalliances with far-right extremists and, of course, pushing conspiracy theories, most notably the birther conspiracy theory, which, of course, Donald Trump's sympathetic with. But most of all, I mean, the worst thing about Arpaio was that he blatantly violated the law, blatantly ignored judges' orders, and was convicted of contempt of court for doing so. And that was what Trump gave him a pardon for something that should never have been eligible for a pardon in the first place. And it was clearly, it not only undermined the rule of law, it was also clearly a sort of sympathetic gesture to people on the radical right who have been Arpaio's primary supporters for many years, and to whom he, pretty much owes his primary allegiance. Then second, of course, was Dinesh D'Souza, who's considered, of course, more mainstream because he shows up on Fox News and stuff, and has some books and movies out. But in fact, the content of D'Souza's work is primarily, especially these days, aimed at muddying the waters, a la Jonah Goldberg, by claiming that, well, the left are the real fascists, right? Mm-hmm. And that fascism is a phenomenon of the left. And this has actually become one of the main talking points of people on the radical right when you engage in social media and so forth, because in fact, D'Souza has a history of promoting far-right ideas and agendas. Mm-hmm. So for Trump to, again, give him a pardon for something that he actually pleaded guilty to and admitted he did is ironic. And of course, it's especially ironic because it was voter fraud, which he claimed he had he even had a commission, you recall, at one point, supposedly attacking voter fraud. It was just
phony voter fraud claims are something that Donald Trump has done as well.
Totally. And then finally, the Dwight and Daryl Hammond pardons. These are the two men who inspired the Malheur standoff. The Hammonds, you need to understand, actually had a history of this Clive and Bundy type confrontation.
20 years, really.
20 years, going back to the 90s, when they were very much involved in the Sagebrush Rebellion stuff of the 1990s and these land disputes with the federal government. And, what they did was, what they were convicted of doing was setting fire to federal lands and causing millions of dollars in damage to those public lands.
Yeah, I mean, they endangered lives.
And they endangered lives, that's right.
Some Bureau of Land Management firefighters were trapped behind one of their fires.
Correct. And, the whole dispute arose because the judge who originally handled their case decided to ignore federal statute, and which included mandatory minimum sentence for this act, for causing a fire. There were mandatory minimum sentences set for that, and I'm not a fan of mandatory minimums, but that's the law.
Right.
And the judge ignored the law and imposed a lesser sentence. So when the appeals courts reviewed the case, they said, no, we need to impose the mandatory minimum sentence. And the Hammonds were then returned to prison, and that's what sparked the whole Malheur standoff.
That's when people were claiming that they were being treated unfairly, which is something, kind of a theme with Trump's pardons. People who violated the law, but he thought they were treated unfairly.
Well, and their favorite thing was to call this tyranny,
right,
of the federal government, and There's no projection is not just for theaters.
Yeah, I noticed this week he's also said that he thinks Paul Manafort's being treated unfairly. Also, I noticed
Yes.
that is a theme that has emerged. So
yeah, well, he's pretty obviously signaling Manafort that he's going to give him a pardon too.
yeah,
Right.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So.
Are there more hate groups now? I
Yes.
mean, definitely.
Well, there are actually fewer hate groups, but many more people engaged in extremist politics.
I see.
Because they're actually organizing primarily online now.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a trend that we started seeing in 2013 and was really kind of reached its apotheosis in 2015. Was that the actual numbers of people joining hate groups was declining, and the number of hate groups organizing started declining in 2015. And it kind of reached its apotheosis in 2015 when Dylan Roof killed 9 people in a black church in Charleston. And this is a young man who did not belong to any hate groups, but spent all of his time online with them. He was spending all of his time reading Council of Conservative Citizens propaganda. He is reading and engaging in forums on the neo-Nazi website, The Daily Stormer, and he was, also engaged on the neo-Nazi site Stormfront. So he was doing all this online, but he never actually joined any of these organizations, and that's what we're actually seeing.
He was just a fan of these groups.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of this, although there are new forms of hate groups coming around that are sort of mutations, and in that respect, so one of the hate groups that we designated this year is the Proud Boys.
Okay.
And the Proud Boys are pretty interesting because they're not really, they're very closely associated with the alt-right. All of its figures are really kind of alt-right sympathetic, particularly its founder, Gavin McInnes, yet they are not specifically white nationalist. So we don't designate them alt-right, but we do designate them a hate group because what they actually engage in is a sort of generic hate. They hate women. There's a lot of misogyny running through the Proud Boys, and really vicious misogyny. There is, there's hatred of liberals, there's hatred of Jews, there's hatred of minorities. So there's a lot of...
They sound like they have a lot in common with white nationalists.
They do, but it's all really more about attacking the other side rather than actually, what nationalism is about is creating this idea of a white ethno-state. And that's the essence of white nationalism. And they probably privately do that, but they don't actually, they're very careful not to do. It's not part of their public platform because it allows them a certain degree of deniability when it comes to being called alt-right. So, but the reality is we've just looked past that sort of ruse, and we say, no, this is a hate group because they're, classically engaging in the demonization and dehumanization of whole groups of people for their ineluctable characteristics. That's our criteria for what is a hate group.
Well, speaking of this white nationalist and the definition and the white ethno-state, that kind of ties into Russia a little bit because they do seem to have a love of Russia, which, from what I've read, they view Russia as the last white ethno-state country, in the world, and they're attracted to that.
Oh, well, they love it, but it's actually not. I don't think it's as much the white nationalist aspect of Russia that they like. It's the authoritarianism, and that's what we really are talking about here. This is the underlying subject of all this stuff. Is that we're talking about this rising tide of right-wing authoritarianism in the country, and authoritarianism is. When we talk about authoritarianism, people think of the leaders and Trump being the example, but actually, the authoritarian leaders have distinct personalities that are different in many important ways from authoritarian followers. And what has always concerned me, and the reason I wrote my book, Alt America, The Rise of the Radical Right in the Age of Trump, was the recognition. I started writing it well before the election because I recognized that even if Trump went away tomorrow, we were going to have this long-running systemic problem of the army of authoritarian followers that he was helping to generate. Now that's that it is systemic because it actually long precedes Trump. The trends of authoritarianism in this country really began rising dramatically after 9/11 and were generated in places like Fox News as well as on InfoWars, even though those worlds were very disparate during the Bush years. But after Obama was elected, they very much came together and formed this single universe I call Alt America, this alternative universe, this epistemological bubble they've created for themselves. And the Tea Party was the main venue for that coalition.
Right.
And that was where we started seeing all this stuff from the radical patriot movement, patriot militia movement, suddenly becoming mainstreamed through the Tea Party. Probably the symbolic, the best symbol of that was the way the Gadsden flag was the symbol of the Tea Party. Those of us who followed the militia movement in the 90s know that that flag originally appeared as part of the Patriot Militia movement and was popularized by them. So, but so were all these ideas and everything else that was being passed in the mainstream. And so, you know, during the Obama years, we really saw this authoritarianism rising and bubbling up, and then Trump basically seized it and rode in on it.
He's been courting these people.
He has,
been,
yes.
These aren't relationships that developed overnight. This is a multi-year process that he's been cultivating these.
Yes, and he's very much been he very much is, you know, part of their mindset.
Are there characteristics that they share?
There are. Let me first kind of would you like me to first describe the authoritarian followers? Authoritarian followers are basically typified by, or what we know from the dynamic is that they are sort of characterized by three behavioral and attitudinal clusters. First is authoritarian submission, the idea that in order to have a safe and civil society and secure society, we all need to submit to the rule of the authoritarian leader who can solve all these problems like a Hercules at the Gordian knot.
I alone can fix it.
Yes, and that he can cut through all the red tape with his sword like a Gordian knot thing, right? And it has to be, I should add, one of the components is that this leader has to be viewed as legitimate, right? So that's the first component. Second is authoritarian aggression, which is aggression against anyone who fails to submit, or somewhat secondarily, anyone who is viewed as an illegitimate leader, cough Barack Obama, right? Then the third is conventionalism, this idea that they represent the mainstream of America, that they're the real Americans, that their views are the conventional views of the rest of the country. And those three clusters create a whole series of sort of subtraits, primarily compartmentalized thinking. You know, they throw anything into the compartment that agrees with their predetermined narrative, and they throw anything out of the compartment that doesn't make it work. So this leads and it also creates very much a willingness to subscribe to conspiracy theories, and it leads to willingness to either make excuses for, or rationalize, or even adopt bigoted beliefs, racial, ethnic, and otherwise. And it goes through, you know, there's a whole series of other sort of subtraits that these three clusters create. Now, authoritarian leaders are actually rather different. They don't really operate around those three clusters, although they have definitely the belief in the authoritarian leader, right? But and the submission. But you know, they're more like what an authoritarian leader is like is fundamentally a narcissist on steroids, right?
I mean,
you know, so there's sociopathic, almost the point of psychopathic. They manipulate people. They're very Machiavellian. They don't actually have any empathy for other people, and that's not always true of right-wing authoritarian followers, right? But the leaders are very much that way. And not only that, the followers aren't themselves personally, don't seek personal political power other than through the group, whereas the leaders are very much power hungry and power driven. So that's those are the key differences. The main thing that they hold in common is their view of equality. And this is actually sort of the dividing point between all right-wing authoritarians and all of the rest of us. They believe that inequality is the natural state of things, and that we actually exist naturally in a sort of, Darwinian dog-eat-dog world, and that's just the way things are, and that any attempt to mess with it is unnatural.
Disrupting the natural order.
Yes, yes. And whereas the rest of us who believe in democracy and things like that, we understand that rising tide lifts all boats, and that it's not a zero-sum game out there. That actually equality of opportunity and equality under the law are absolutely essential components of any kind of just democracy and effective democracy. And yes, it is natural. We have a long history of this sort of Darwinian life, but we don't have to be that way. Just like we don't have to enslave people anymore.
Right.
There's always a progression in mankind, and certainly the desire for equality is part of, I believe, that story of human progress. So, and I think most people do. And actually, I think we're vastly in the majority of these people, but nonetheless, there is, that's the dividing line ultimately between right-wing authoritarians and the rest of us.
Wow. Well, I think one last question.
Sure.
You live in the Pacific Northwest, where there is a rise on the left. Can you talk a little bit about that? And
Sure. Well, I actually think this has actually been vastly overstated in the media. I've been assigned to cover most of these free speech events. I was at the
there's one happening today in Portland.
There is one happening today, and we'll get to that. But it started for me on inauguration night in Seattle. There was a Milo Yiannopoulos rally at the University of Washington, and a huge counter-protest turned out, and a man standing 10 feet away from me was shot.
Oh, wow.
And so he survived, but it was
terrifying.
It was terrifying. And most of these, so I've covered quite a number of these rallies since in Portland, in Berkeley, San Francisco, Olympia, Washington, Vancouver, Washington, and Seattle. And they have been, typically there's always a certain level of violence at these rallies. And the point of the whole rallies is kind of a real life troll of people on the left. Now, there are people who've been coming out, the black bloc folks, left-wing authoritarians, and of course we've seen them rising really ever since 1999 and the sort of WTO riots, right? That was where we sort of saw the black bloc folks first coming out.
In Seattle, when the World Trade Organization was there.
And they're very much making their presence felt at these rallies, because they are actually willing to engage in violence to attack these alt-righters, and of course most of the time it's pretty much mutual combat. Both sides are attacking each other, but it's not very. It's very much antithetical to the sort of discipline that people who believe in nonviolent protest would see, and the vast majority of the counter-protesters out there are actually of that ilk. Yet, you know, the left has gotten this reputation as being extremely violent. It's very tiny. It's a very tiny minority of these people who actually are violent. And honestly, let's be honest. Black Bloc and the anti-fascists nationally number in the thousands. Okay. When we're talking about just the alt-right, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions.
Wow.
And when we talk about and that's not even including the Patriot Militia movement, which is actually a distinct segment, and they're widespread, far more than most people realize, throughout rural America.
Right.
So we have those two components. Literally, we're talking about radical right movement comprised of, if you throw all of the various segments together, really a movement of millions of people.
Is there anything that we can do to combat it?
Yeah, vote.
Okay.
It's really very clear. You know, these are profoundly anti-democratic movements. They're about an attack on democracy and trying to replace democracy with an authoritarian system. And this is where, of course, Russia comes in. You were asking about Russia earlier. The reason they love Russia is that because Putin is an authoritarian, he is engendering authoritarianism around the world. His money is going to finance radical right movements throughout Europe. We've seen them succeed in Hungary. We're seeing authoritarian government in Turkey. We're seeing them succeed in Austria and nearly succeed in France.
Wow.
You know,
spreading.
So it is spreading, and actually succeed in Italy too, I must add. So we have basically very rightist authoritarianism on the rise all around the globe, and a lot of this is being financed by Putin.
Wow.
And yes, the alt-right is
a serious threat.
It is a serious threat to democracy. People need to understand, and you know, when they saw those people marching with tiki torches in Charlottesville, that's what that was about. That was an attack on democracy, and these people are dead serious about it. We need to, and the only thing they really understand is raw, brute political power. And the only political power we have is through the vote. That's what we do. So it's been great this week here at Netroots because everybody here is about organizing people to vote.
Right.
And that's, so my message is very much falling on eager ears here, because not everybody understands how vital it is to organize the vote, to get people out to vote, to get your friends out to vote, because I truly believe we vastly outnumber them. We just need to wake people up to the threat to our democracy and our democratic institutions. It is serious. So yeah.
All right. Well, I'm probably going to toss and turn tonight, and then I'm going to wake up and start registering voters tomorrow. So, all right. I really appreciate you coming by.
You bet.
So great to meet you.
You bet.
Okay.